All right, let's get started. So thank you everyone once again for being here this afternoon. We're thrilled to have you here for our final panel. As a quick reminder, please log into Whova and be ready to submit your questions to our panelists. Login details are on the QR code on the back of your program and they will be on screen. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to submit them through Whova and vote on your favorites. Now, I know everyone is eager to hear our final session, so without further delay, I am pleased to move into our next session, Indigenous Economic Development as a Key Component to Reconciliation. The Paper Excellence Group has grown through acquisitions from, generously sponsored by Paper Excellence. The Paper Excellence Group has grown through acquisitions from a single mill to a global group of facilities producing pulp and tissue, paper and packaging, and wood products, with more than 21,300 employees. In British Columbia, Paper Excellence operates 4 mills: Catalyst Port Alberni, Catalyst Crofton, Howe Sound Pulp and Paper, and Skookumchuck Pulp. Headquartered in Canada, the company is taking a thoughtful, policy-driven approach to building our Indigenous relations program. We demonstrate a long-term commitment to building relationships with Indigenous communities and know that reconciliation through collaboration creates enduring and meaningful connections. And with that, it is now my sincere pleasure to introduce Owen Miller, President of Deadwood Innovations, who will be moderating our final panel.
There we go. That's better. Logan, we have a mic that doesn't work. All right. How's this for a time slot for a first-time moderator? Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to run through a round of introductions here to get going. On the end here, we've got Bob Simpson. So unfortunately, we had a panelist due to travel constraints. Dallas couldn't make it, but as soon as I got the email that Dallas wasn't here, I looked in the back of the room and I seen Bob. The way that the light was shining off your head, it was angelic and it was destiny. So yeah, went right to him and he was game. So thank you, Bob, for stepping in. Bob's the former MLA and Mayor Quesnel. He's now consulting for First Nations on government-to-government relations and ECDEV projects. Next to Bob is Troy Young. Troy's the president at ROGA Group and a member of Wet'suwet'en First Nations. And next to me is Murray Sholty, a law professor at TRU and also a member of Wet'suwet'en First Nations. So Troy, I'm going to hand it over to you for an acknowledgement and to talk a little bit about your relationship with LTN.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to give an acknowledgement. How's this sound? It's okay. Acknowledgement to the Clay if any of the members are here, we've had a long-standing relationship between my family's business and the community. Together, we built a company called LTN Contracting for over 22 years. We worked together to develop the company, and I just acknowledge that, it was an honor working here. We built a good relationship, and I look forward to the continued success that they have been experiencing. So, thank you.
Thanks, Troy. So, for the purpose of our conversation today, we're gonna pull together the title of our conversation into economic reconciliation. So, economic reconciliation is a vital part of the process of making economic amends for historical injustices to Indigenous peoples. It must create meaningful partnerships and mutually beneficial opportunities for realizing economic prosperity. We're going to provide definitions for context and perspective on our diverse panel. We're going to highlight some examples of successful projects, partnerships, and business models. And we'll examine some opportunities and threats moving forward and take some questions from the audience at the end. Okay, and we're going to start with the gentleman next to me, Murray Sholty. I'm going to put you on the spot right away, and I'm going to ask you to give me an example of how you have actioned reconciliation.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Owen, for that kind introduction. Quick correction. I'm a member of Hagglegate Village, but close. That's okay. I probably should have pointed that out earlier. That's okay, though. Just to give a little bit of background, though, I'm originally from the booming metropolis of Fort Fraser. Even though I teach law in Kamloops, I don't want you to hold that against me. So when I say booming metropolis, if you know Fort Fraser, it's about 250 people in town and about 250 out. So I lived on the outskirts. So I don't know if that makes me a bad guy or not. Also, to give context, a lot of times I've seen, or I used to think that if there was someone from an academic background, you're like, oh, okay, what's going on? Before that, I actually was involved in the natural resource sector. So silviculture, which was tree planting, brushing, spacing, and then eventually logging. So, feller bunchers, skidders, and that type of stuff. So I'll get to how I have been involved. So I'll put it in the education context. So right now at TRU Law, they're hosting what's called the Kewaskumon Aboriginal Moot, National Aboriginal Moot. And it's been going for about 30 years. So it brings in both Indigenous law students and non-Indigenous law students. And it's the first one ever held, again, at TRU Law. And I'm very fortunate because I did it myself 10 years ago, so I'm dating myself a little bit. And then the dean asked me if I'd chair it. So what a moot is, so some people might not know, in this context, it's a mock negotiation. Okay, and it's based on a hypothetical problem, but we kind of grounded it in a natural resource context. So the area that we're doing it in is Secwepemc territory, and we're dealing with an area called Jacko Lake. And if you're familiar with Kamloops, Aberdeen up on the hill, just above Aberdeen in the back, there's Jacko Lake, and it's of tremendous cultural value to the Secwepemc, and they call it Pipsel, okay? And so going back to what the mooters do, so we have 20 law schools coming in, usually 2 teams, international professors in Aboriginal law, Indigenous law, and also we have facilitators coming in, sometimes judges, sometimes negotiators with no legal background, but they're negotiators. And then we have guests coming in. So for our keynote speaker, one of them is Chief Justice Leonard Marchand, who just got appointed. And we're so excited for him because he's an Indigenous person, and it's great to see him in that position, and he supports TRU Law a lot. But going back to the moot problem, we have to create that, so that takes some work. And I might have to help get some sponsors. So if you see me coming towards you, don't run away if I'm trying to shake you down for money. But anyway, so it's really exciting because, again, you're drawing First Nations students, non-First Nations, and it's about developing ideas. Like we work through, they might think about rights and title, and we hear about that in duty to consult. But this issue framed around Pipsel is we're looking for a governance framework, okay? And it could be specifically for this area, or it could be for the territory in general. And why we're very excited about this project, and we think it helps with reconciliation, is some of these young students, and not so young, but students are going to be the next legal minds, in a lot of cases lawyers, but they're actually going to be business leaders, okay? And they're going to be involved in this work. And so we think it's an important piece of work, right? Aboriginal rights and title and duty to consult. But what about next steps moving forward? So that's where I figure, we're helping out at TRU Law.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. And important to highlight that reconciliation is post-secondary education is another mechanism, right? Yeah. Appreciate
Absolutely.
that. Okay, reconciliation. We've heard that word a lot over the past couple days, and I'm going to ask Troy what that means to you. What is reconciliation to you?
Well, I guess I would say, frame it as, from myself personally, I look at business and the economic development in communities as returning to what we were. Before contact we had trading networks running up and down the coast. You can find products all over North America that came out of BC. So that is one of the, we're going back to where we were. Used to own not just the territory that we used as the trading material, but the contacts and so on were important, and we're trying to get back to that. And throughout the province, we've got relationships with different First Nations, and from my perspective, when I talk to a community, I want to find out what's important to them and what they view the changes as being, because it's not my job to tell people what reconciliation should look like. It's our job to find out what the community wants, how they feel things should move forward, and act on those thoughts, feelings, and go forward with that.
Yeah, so it's very much a community level engagement is where you start, and understanding the differences band to band, nation to nation.
Yeah, because we've got a range of relationships that we carry out. Some, such as LTN, we build a business together, and they buy shares from us and run it successfully after. We've got revenue shares, we've got joint ventures, and it all depends on the circumstance of the community, what they would like to do, what they want to see done, whether it's a long-term, short-term relationship. So it varies, and it should vary, because I go back to this all the time. It's not up to me to tell people what they should be doing. If I want to be involved with the community, I have to listen and act on what they wish.
Excellent, thanks. Bob, through your experiences and perspectives through Crown governance and now working at a band level and nation level, do you think that reconciliation has evolved into too much of a business process?
So before I start talking, I want the Cisco group to behave, because I was coming in here worried about the NASCO table throwing stuff at me, not you guys. Post being involved in politics, I've had the privilege of beginning to work with First Nations, and particularly now with NASCO First Nation, on what is reconciliation from their perspective. And one of the questions we've got coming up that speak to one of the challenges is in that economic development domain. What does reconciliation mean there? Because reconciliation at its core deals with things like recognition and rights and title and healing in community. And NASCO Chief and Council in particular are very interested about that community aspect of reconciliation and having the resources to engage in healing, to have the resources for housing, for health, for education. And then you impose this big opportunity on the economic development realm on top of that. And the topic for this is, economic reconciliation. But at the end of the day, what is the structure that elected chiefs and councils can best use to take advantage of the economic opportunities that are being made available to them now? So the question of, is it too much of a business transaction? I think that's a real question for how do you separate out what the true reconciliation path is on the healing, on the dealing with the missing and murdered women, residential school legacy and so on, from the opportunity to resource that with self-sourced income, self-generated income through your economic development opportunities, and what's the best way to take advantage of that? And I guess I would say, if that isn't a business transaction, you're going to be on a long path to get to realize those opportunities. So you have to find a way of having a conversation about business opportunities that, in my estimation, is quite different than the general reconciliation conversations that have to be had with the Crown, have to be had with local government. And I would argue that they have to be more business-oriented conversations, or you're going to have a very difficult time getting to the point where you're realizing the benefits, and that those benefits, financial benefits, jobs, et cetera, then help you achieve your community aspirations. So I think they do have to be more business-oriented and more business kinds of dialogues than the general reconciliation conversations that are going on.
Yeah, right. Thank you. So just some final thoughts, and maybe a little bit of an opportunity for some education, because I'm learning every day. I think it's important to maybe clarify for some folks in the audience. Murray, how's BC unique when it comes to reconciliation?
Yeah, I think, looking at BC, when you first look at it, I mean, most of the land base is unceded land, right? And so unceded land being land that's never surrendered or transferred by Indigenous people that have lived here since time immemorial. So with unceded land, that plays into some of the dynamics of governance, land management, economic development. So that's, how it plays into it. Where BC is doing better than other provinces, for example, I would say, they got reconciliation agreements. They got UNDRIP, the first to implement with DRIPA, and also actioning the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. So that's some highlights there.
And Troy, we're gonna shift the conversation here with away from reconciliation more to an economic development, the economic piece. So can you describe for the group your ideal economic development model, business model, some of maybe the models that you've used in your business development that have been successful, and even some that haven't worked? That's actually related to a question we have here too from the audience, right? So.
Yeah, and it varies. It usually, like our typical discussion starts with, we run into someone at a restaurant and we start talking about stuff, and it comes up that they're doing something, and we'll look at it and say, well, do you guys want to start working together? And if they think I'm a nice guy, they might say yes, they might say no, we don't know. But it starts down the path of having a conversation about what the community would like to do, what the leadership wants to do. And just from a very typical example would be, first thing we're going to do is we'll find a small job to work on and do a joint venture, and we're going to go do the work and see if we like one another. And, is communication good? Are you comfortable with the way we do the work? And from there, if we're, if everyone's happy, then we advance it, and it'll, could lead to a equity company where we start buying equipment and assets to carry out all the work that is being done and build a company from there. And that's my preferred method because, how would you put it? I look at a lot of the revenue share agreements, and I feel it shorts the community because, yes, you're getting a percentage of the profits, but if you own 50% of the company, you still get a percentage of the profits, but you also get 50% of the equity and all the equipment and assets that are being paid for over the project. And when I say project, it could be, something like Coastal GasLink where you're building a pipeline. It could be a logging operation, it could be road maintenance, but you're building that pool that really becomes the base of all the other economic development you want to do, because you've now got something that's sitting there and you own it and it's creating revenue, and you just kind of start from there. And it's not the only model, it's just where I've seen the most success with our partners, it's that model. We've built, within our organization, with our partners, we're either the first or second biggest logging organization in the province, where we could log just over 2 million cubic meters when markets are good. And it's based on different communities where we've got, logging site here and a logging site here and a logging site here. And it's, we're building these together because it provides that platform. and go from there. Is it, and I know it's not the only model, like not all communities want to own equipment, and there's days I honestly don't blame them, because you have to deal with employees and equipment and trucks, and it can drive you crazy. So if you don't want to have that experience, stay out of it. But if you want to, we have a model that works, and we can share our experience. We can talk to people about it, explain, best practices, and go from there.
Yeah, it's the common theme in your responses is very much a community-based approach, right? And a term that I've recently come across is a distinctions-based approach. And apparently it was the first time that even Troy had heard that, as opposed to a pan-Indigenous approach, right? Where, there are very much cultural nuances between bands and between nations, and that must be respected and understood in first engagements about, developing businesses and partnerships.
Yeah, and that'll all flow from those early conversations, and it's important to learn, is the society matrilineal, patrilineal, who are, within the context of Wet'suwet'en, who are the real decision makers, and finding out how to build the trust between both sides so that you feel comfortable when you're, when you're telling us your history and talking about what has gone on. It's important in particular, I find it important that I understand what has happened, and I've got a context that, we've experienced our hardship in Wet'suwet'en territory, and how does it relate? And it creates, I would say, a bond between you by having those conversations about what's going on and how you've dealt with it. And it just leads to better things, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. So a question I'll pose for the whole group, and I'll start on the end. I can tell Bob is ready again for another one. So just can you provide a notable example of economic development in the resource sector? Something you've been involved in, or just a favorite as an observer that sets the tone, sets a good example.
Yeah, and for those of you who know, I just got asked this afternoon, and this was the one that I was hoping you wouldn't ask me, so I don't know about readiness, because it's hard to pick this one because there's a lot going on. But I thought I would use, the Nazco First Nation asked me to come on board in part because they're involved with the North Coast transmission line. Nazco traditional territory extends north of Highway 16 and is shared territory with Leyte and Sycus in particular. And so as a nation, they're involved in that project. And it's an interesting one because it goes back to your original question that you asked, Owen, about there's a linear project that's occurring on top of a previous linear project that left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, Coastal GasLink, in terms of how that evolved with respect to First Nations, some of the divisions that occurred within First Nations over that project, et cetera. So here's BC Hydro as another proponent trying to come in to do another linear project in an area that has already had that kind of history. And as we heard announced here, from the government's perspective and BC Hydro's perspective, they want to explore co-ownership. So in terms of an opportunity, it would be the first utility in British Columbia that's using a co-ownership model with First Nations. And so that is extremely exciting, it's extremely proactive. But now the challenges of the internal work that First Nations need to do to reconcile internal to their communities and in between communities to create a First Nations collaborative that can actually engage with a single Crown corporation. So it's acting as a single entity, but that pathway all the way out to the coast is 22 First Nations minimum. And so the reconciliation work that needs to be done between the First Nations so that they can actually have a collaborative to engage meaningfully with BC Hydro to get to that desired outcome of co-ownership is really deep, hard work that needs to be done. And there's a disparity between some of the First Nations. Some of them are large, have lots of infrastructure, have lots of human resource capacity, have lots of financial capacity, and then smaller ones that have never been involved in a project like this ever before, that are just struggling to do right in their community and don't have those kinds of resources. So I think that North Coast Transmission Line project is a really exciting project for the province. It's an exciting project for First Nations, but it is a lot of deep work, the basis of which is pure reconciliation and then that economic reconciliation that we're talking about. And I was chatting with Minister Osborne last night because I know the province is really wanting to see this advance, and if we can make it work, I think it's a real change in the dynamic in British Columbia on a true economic reconciliation where First Nations start owning some of these larger enterprises in the province and not just piecemeal, business arrangements with individual businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Good example, Bob. Thanks. And Troy, maybe one of your own, even a project, a favorite, a good example, equity ownership, meaningful impact.
Well, I talked about LTN and the success we saw there, so I skipped that one just because I've talked about it already. So we have a relationship. So I'm actually also from Hagelgate Village, which is the next community to Whitsett. My mother grew up in Whitsett, which is the tie there, and 12 years ago, I guess it was now, get approached by the chief at the time, Barry Nicall, and says, well, I know you are one of our, related to our community and you do this work. Would you be interested in coming and help us on our territory? And so we started a conversation, and I don't know, over the last 12 years, we built a company. We're doing, logging for Canfor, did a bunch of work on the Coastal GasLink project. We work for Hydro, do other jobs in the community, building water plants and streets and stuff like that. And just watching the impact it has in the community and, how would you say it, the pride they have in the company that we're developing together, it is profound to me. Go to Whitsett and you're going to see, 24 people wearing tie hats and sweaters and shirts, and throughout the different jobs we've had roughly 80 plus community members that have worked for us on different projects and continue to work with us on projects in the logging side and the pipeline maintenance we do, that type of stuff. So I think it's a good example of where things can go if you've got, two people that are both willing and able to push to get the work and so on. And you think the landscape 10, 12 years ago was different than it is today, where things seem a lot more open to First Nations business. So it was a big struggle in those early days where, we're kind of having to push into a project and say, well, if you want to do it on our territory, this is how it's going to be done, and carrying forward with that. So I look at it as a good example of what can be done and the longevity that it's going to provide in the workspace through our working together for years and years and developing, the infrastructure within the company so that it's not just the low-level jobs that are community members. It's kind of, you might start at a low level, but you're going to have the opportunity to work up to be, supervisor, a manager, president of the company. And the change you see in the community when they know that if they're working there, that there is a future, compared to, I'm not saying all situations, but a lot of the projects where, they're going to guarantee employment, but it's usually kept at a lower level. And by building that company together and having the upward mobility, you see a change in the way the community views it, because it's now theirs. It's the future that they want, and both sides are very proud of it. So that'd probably be one of my best examples.
Yeah, that's great. Upward mobility, that's key. Murray.
Yeah, no, I first also got to point out that, I highlighted that I was from Hagelgate Village, and then Troy a little bit had to point that out, because we have a Chief, Dora Wilson, who's a very strong lady. She's been a chief for 20 years. If we didn't clarify it, Troy and I might be getting an email or a phone call later on saying, hey, what's going on with you guys? Another thing, though, is I got to point out to Troy is he gave me a little bit of a flashback, and I don't know if it was good. He's talking about, hey, do you really want to own equipment? Because driving up here, I used to have, as I mentioned, bunchers, skidders, and stuff like that. I'm driving up here and it's cold, and I'm like, oh man, I'm glad I'm not going out in the middle of nowhere, parachuting over a skidder 40 below with a Tiger torch. Ooh, I don't even know if I should have said that, because maybe there's some WCB guys in here, but you know what? The statute of limitations is probably up. So anyway, I do have a couple examples, and Owen, I'm impressed with what you've done with Deadwood, working with Nina Cosley, bringing out an innovative forestry innovation that doesn't happen often. I'm impressed, and the reason why is also the partnership, right? So you've done well with the partnership. You're taking on different perspectives from the Indigenous partner. Again, impressed because it's an innovative product. And I've also been really happy because you've come to TRU Law, and a lot of times, sometimes the theory and the practice in university, it's kind of separated. And in my classes, I try to get both. And so Owen comes out and shares his experiences and how he went about it, but highlighting that it might not be a pan-Indigenous approach. You have to look at it individually. So it's been very impressive. I'm also very impressed with this gentleman right here, Mr. Young, because he's had such tremendous business success. And for business people that have worked in the natural resource sector, you have to have a lot of resilience because it's highly seasonal, it's cyclical, it's capital intensive. So to come out on top, and I'm gonna hit him up for a loan later too. No, sorry, sponsorship. You have to have some moxie, so that's impressive that he's done it. And how he shared with you today, he shared like that at TRU Law. So he comes in here, he comes to class, and the students are sitting there, and he's like, this is how I did it. Yep, it's 50%, you get equity, there's some more money. He's laying out the roadmap, and the students are like, holy Jesus. Like, he's sharing, and a lot of business people won't, and even in the case of innovators. So they're sharing about what they're doing, they're sharing about how they're working with First Nations. So those are two really good examples. And don't forget about the sponsorship.
Thanks.
Thanks, Maria. I appreciate that. I'm just going to put this out, and whomever wishes to respond, please feel free. Can you identify a threat moving forward? So, we've talked about reconciliation and economic development at the community level, a very community-based focus and distinct approach. But based on the current state, looking ahead, and even some of the conversations that have been had here this week, what do we got to be looking out for?
I can jump in there. So I wouldn't classify as a threat, but a challenge. It's something to overcome. So, I do First Nations consulting work too. So I work with chief and councils with leadership stuff, HR work, also economic development planning and business planning. So some probably similar work to what Bob does. What you're seeing as First Nations looking at issues internally, so I'll flag a couple. So the difference between citizenship and membership. So if you're a member of a band, you have Indian status. But some nations might want to move more to a citizenship model, and so they might have to expand that and see how that works. Okay, and the reason why that's an issue is because you've seen in the newspapers with pretend Indians, and it's been in the education context a lot, but that might happen in the business context. We're talking about big dollars, so it wouldn't surprise me if it has happened or it will happen. We're also looking at the ideas of on-reserve and off-reserve members. I have a student that inspired him to come to law school because he had to, put a claim against his First Nation, sue them in federal court. It's still working its way before the court because he's an off-reserve member. They have a custom election code which wouldn't favor him or wouldn't allow him to run for council because he's off-reserve. So you have that dynamic playing out, and they're working through it. It'll happen, it'll change, but there's that dynamic. Then when you're thinking in the context of Aboriginal rights and title, a lot of times you're thinking collective rights. So if an opportunity comes in, is it for the collective? Is it for the individual? Or is it for both? And then also some communities are thinking about the challenges of what is a First Nations business. Is it 51% owned? or 50. And then another key thing, and I'll jump off here before I get too long-winded, but is in the situation of impact benefit agreements or agreements, is that taking away from rights and title negotiation? Because if you're not dealing with that type of problem, like rights and title on land, and you keep having these agreements, you're kind of maybe contracting around it or just kind of working around it. So these are kind of things that I see that First Nations are working through.
Great. So it's interesting watching these questions come up. Just out of my own curiosity, the questions that I have written down here for notes that were, asked of the panel here, they align almost perfectly with the questions that came through. So there's definitely some commonality there, which is kind of neat. There is a question that we haven't spoke to. So Bob, you put your hand up there for a sec, like you wanted to respond to this, and then I'll get to that last question before we run out of time.
Yeah, and it actually goes to the first question about First Nations Economic Development Corporations. So in terms of threat and I think, the idea of challenge, I think there's a real threat in British Columbia, and it goes to what you were saying before about DRIPA and so on, is there's a disparity among First Nations on capacity. But when you talk about, what was it, Pan First Nations or whatever?
Pan-Indigenous approach.
Pan-Indigenous, treat them all the same. So the opportunities that are being presented to take over child welfare, to have your education system, to have a health center, to do housing, etc., are across the board among First Nations. And all those opportunities that they're including these economic development opportunities, but not all First Nations are equal in their capacity to actually deal with that and respond to it. So a real threat is overwhelming. What I would argue is the vast majority of smaller First Nations, more remote First Nations that don't have that resource, that human resource capacity to be able to embrace all of the opportunities that are available to them. And one of the risks on the economic development side or challenges is this idea of what's the most appropriate economic development corporation model to use. The answer to that, to go back to the flavor of the conversation, is the one that's going to work for that nation. But Jody Wilson-Raybould points out in her book on reconciliation that one of the things we don't talk often enough about is that part of reconciliation is reconciling the Crown laws, whether federal or provincial, with how First Nations have governed themselves for millennia. And one of those areas hits real hard at economic development because of the laws regarding liability. So First Nations are forced effectively under existing law to sever themselves from liability by creating a formal economic development corporation. But as the questioner asked, what's the relationship then between chief and council, who are elected to guide and lead that nation, and then this board that you have to structure, and you have to put a wall between chief and council and the board in order to sever liability from business transactions that might go sideways on you. And I think the province needs to sit down with First Nations leadership and start answering this question. How can we develop a First Nations economic development corporation model that respects the way First Nations want to make decisions, but still gives them severed liability for commercial transactions? To me, that's a real question that's begged right now in BC and needs to be addressed for both the business partners and for the First Nations leadership so that we can take advantage of all of these opportunities that are available right now.
Thanks, Bob. So, respecting our time left here, any final closing thoughts from the rest of the panel?
Sure, I'll jump in there. So kind of in that line, with what we're doing at TRU law, I talked about Aboriginal rights and title, and those are the common courses, and they have other offerings like comparative Indigenous law, international law, and they actually have a specific course on truth and reconciliation. But they brought me in to work with First Nations governance and economic development because those are some of the questions, Bob, that they want to work on and think about. And then also First Nations business and taxation, and that's more at the enterprise level. And so I think you highlighted that really well, Bob. A lot of times the corporations force the corporate model because of liability, but it also affects taxation, Section 87 tax exemption, or the public law or public exemption, or kind of a municipal exemption. And I think you highlighted it accurately about that's another key thing that's different than most businesses when you're going with structure compared to First Nations, is you're thinking about the governance piece. Is it at arm's length or not? And sometimes it might not be, because the people with the ability that might be chief and council and are governing or in governance also are the good business people. So sometimes the model might not always be like arm's length, which is a good practice because less conflict of interest and self-dealing, but there's other times that you want to keep that business tight. So I think that's important.
Yep, thanks, Murray. All right, we hope that was engaging and maybe a learning experience for some. So I guess that's a wrap on the panels for this year's BC Natural Resource Forum. Mussy, thank you.
Oh, come on, they were the last panel of this year's forum. Let's see. All right, lads, we're going to take your photo, and I've got a thank you gift on behalf of the organizers, BC Natural. One more time, come on. And a first-time moderator, I'll tell you. Did pretty good, didn't he? Eh? All right, Jason's going to set up the group photo, which is tradition here at BCNRF, and then Logan's going to hand you a gift. What Frank Peebles is doing here, well, Table 2, I want to thank you. You were excellent. Didn't throw anything at Bob. Oh, one without the badge. Thank you, Sarah. She does it all as president and CEO. Table 2, you're excused. No, really. I'll have to get this story from Bob. The things you don't learn here at the BC Natural Resources. Good luck with that, buddy. Let's hear it for Logan. Great. Thank you, gifter. All right. Thank you for staying. We've got about a couple of minutes here to go. We have just got that. Thank you. Could you join me in thanking our 2024 BC Natural Resources sponsors? You've heard about them for 2.5 days. Let's give them a big thank you. We can't do this without their support. How about the exhibitors? I tell you, that fresh salmon from Vancouver Island, that was pretty tasty. Thank you. That's their 3rd year coming all the way up to Old Prince George, Claytley Country. Let's hear it for the Prince George Conference and Civic Center team. What a great bunch. Levy Canada, they're called. Now, these folks, I tell you, they're already thinking about 2025. Let's acknowledge our forum team. They're the folks that you deal with as sponsors, speakers, exhibitors. Some of you trying to get an exhibit spot. Apparently, it's a few years waiting list. Well, that's not too bad. But let's thank these folks. Melissa McRitchie, Heidi Martell, Brona Furlong, Merle Nelson, Nicole Vandervliet, Logan Wang, born right here in Claytley Country, Claire Perouse, she couldn't make it, Jean McCorkadale, John Dunphy, Brandy Butler, Emily Milne, Kim Hayshurst, and the fabulous, and I need some rockin' here, fabulous Sarah Weber. Yeah, she's pretty cool, isn't she? Your registration, attendance, and support is what motivates our forum team to keep new ideas coming, and we hope that you enjoyed all the sessions this year. If you did enjoy this event, we invite you to our partner conference, the 8th Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, April 24 to 26 at the Vancouver Island Conference Centre in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Oh, dates, right. Logan? Dates for 2025, they're still being considered. 14 to 16, Mark your calendars now. January 14 to 16, 2025. All right, give yourselves a hand. You've been a beautiful audience, very cooperative. We thank you. Oh, just a sec. Logan's got a surprise for us. Go ahead, sir.
And can we just give a very, very warm welcome to Kevin Brown. Thank him very much. We just got word he may not return next year. He's a legendary MC, and we want to thank him very, very much for all of his years of service.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Safe travels home. We'll see you here next year. Thanks, everyone.